Invariably, didn't you, Jim? You know, it always
Depends on what story you're talking.
What Jim said was his father threatened him with the Red Cross if Jim didn't write to his mother weekly. Well, Jim didn't want to do that, so he wrote to his mother weekly. Then one evening, I heard Jim's wife, Babs, say that the letters had been taken to Nashville to be preserved and that they wanted to donate them to the archives at LSUA. Well, that made me start thinking about the possibility of a program. I know Jim Leggett well enough to know that these letters could be quite interesting. Nothing like, "Dear Mom and Dad, it sure is hot here and the food is terrible." So here we are this afternoon, ready to listen to some letters Jim wrote 50 years ago. And our guest host is Matthew Dunn, who has made broadcasting his career. Matt hosts the morning radio show, Talkback 970 with Matt and Jim. Matt and Jim are longtime friends, and you are the perfect person to introduce Jim Leggett.
Thanks to everyone for being here. It kind of feels like Vietnam in here right now. Are there any Vietnam veterans with us today? Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. And are there any other former service people in the room? Thank you. Once again, we'd like to thank everyone, especially LSUA, for having us here today. And mainly, would not only like to thank everyone for Jim, but for Babs and I, as Babs and I have the distinct pleasure of waking up with Jim on a daily basis. You know, as a millennial, I'm of the opinion that not as many of us understand the Vietnam War as we do other American-involved conflicts. We don't have the same grasp of sacrifice nor the glorifying history bestowed on veterans who served in previous or post-conflicts before or after Vietnam. Most of us were educated, rather, about the divisiveness of the country at the time. How young men, many of whom were drafted, were sent off to a foreign Southeast Asian country to die for a war that many of us didn't believe in. Ironically, a lot of millennials trace their inspirations of questioning government or lack of acceptance of the status quo back to this time in our country's history. Very few of us will talk about the darker, rebellious side here on the home front, the side of history to where only the Civil War exemplified a more divided people. I'm of course referring to the fact that some people not only protested and rebelled, but turned the American GI who was returning home into an enemy. It's important to hear examples of stories like Jim's to further educate millennials and beyond about the true story of Vietnam from the people who actually served there. And as more and more Vietnam veterans age, we continue to lose opportunities to hear about these accounts. So think about this, going back to World War II. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs statistics says that we are losing 372 veterans per day of the greatest generation. So that means that of the over 16 million who served our country in World War II, about 620,000 of them are still with us today. So think about that by doing the math. That means in 25 years, the same is going to be said for those who served in Vietnam. So it's important that Jim's dad made him promise to send his mother letters during this time in Vietnam so that we have the opportunities to hear what we're going to hear today. Before I turn it over to Jim, I want you to know that he and Babs have played vital roles in my family's life for nearly my entire existence. When my mom and I moved here in 1989, it was Jim and Babs who introduced my mother to my late stepfather, Ned. Little did Jim and I I know that about 30 years later, we'd be co-hosting a talk show together. So I'm honored to not only be here for my lifelong friend and co-host, but as a millennial who respects the hell out of the sacrifice of Vietnam veterans. So with that said, I introduce my good friend and co-host, James Leggett.